Ow. 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 Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, we have the final 10 duties to reach 200 just in time for Dawn Trail. Once again, I switched things up by doing the 10 duties alternating between DPS, tank and healer, and further switched to a different job each time. We could have had a lot of variety in this set, but unfortunately, every time an 8-man duty popped, it failed to start. So once again, we mainly had a lot of leveling duties. With that said, for duty 1, we went to the Praetorium as Reaper. The tank pulled a bit weirdly because they consistently used a ranged attack on one mob and then had issues probably pulling together everything with AoE attacks afterwards. Not that it was a huge problem. It could have been a problem in a more threatening dungeon though. The reason why it mildly concerns me is that I saw them use Provoke on one of the clones on the Gaius fight. I also got the impression the Astrologian wasn't that forward with playing their cards, but they were playing cards and a bunch of them, so it is probably going to be fine. They were also a returning player, so they were probably getting back in the swing of things. This group was also very polite in a way you might not see that often. When the healer disconnected before the first boss, we all just waited for them. When the dancer was way behind leading up to Nero, we waited for them. This kind of waiting is totally not necessary and probably a waste of time, but I do think it is a nice thing to do. Anyway, the run was perfectly fine. For duty 2, we went to Malikah's well as Gunbreaker. Right out the gate, the scholar warned that they were a novice and expressed concern that pulls might get scuffed. I reassured them that we would try our best and adjust if needed, only for the scholar to actually use their entire toolkit and spending the majority of these 2 brutal AoE pulls at the start spamming Art of War. Great. So instead of needing to comfort them over potential mistakes, I let them know they didn't seem like a novice to me. The rest of the duty went perfectly fine with no major issues, until we reached the final boss. And the Heretic's Fork in sequence really caused some issues for the DPS players in particular. Note that you can actually stay within melee range while even the center cross resolves, as long as you don't mind getting your nose blasted with lasers. It is really good for the skin in moderate amounts, very effective for polishing the nose and face scales. For duty 3, we went to Holminster Switch with a Dark Knight that did not seem to know how to tank super well. After the initial big pull, I asked them to use the Blackest Night, TBN, more, and we talked a bit back and forth on that. They were concerned it was expensive, and I pointed out it is only one of 3 things to spend MP on anyway, and it gives the other ones for free. After that, it seemed they used TBN very aggressively for the rest of the duty, which is much better than the alternative. They were not super great about using defensive cooldowns proactively in general, aside from for dealing with tank busters, but I decided to leave that alone. They at least learned the TBN thing. And they are pulling carefully, 1 pack at a time, so I can deal with it. Maybe they will learn the defensive cooldown stuff next time. Overall, I got a strong impression both the Dark Knight and the Monk were less experienced with their jobs, and possibly not super well acquainted with Holminster Switch, given the kinds of mistakes they made. Although, they did seem to respect the boss mechanics to the best of their ability. For example, they were positioning for the mini limit card mechanic on the second boss, and on the final boss, while they were slow to react to the chains mechanic, they were fast to react to a marked target. Finally, I'll also say the Red Mage was clearly well experienced, and they were also considerate, as I saw a few times at the start of the dungeon where they were running ahead to get ready to pull more. But not once did they actually pull for the tank. They also played very well and reliably. By the way, did you know that Warrior can solo Holminster Switch synced? Yes, despite the chains at the end. For duty 4, we went to the Guildhest enemy parties as Samurai. Oh boy, what a fight! It was so hard! I totally had to prioritize targets to make the most of my single target damage so we could kill everything at around the same time. Absolutely crucially necessary. So anyway, the fight ended quite quickly. For duty 5, we went to Ktisis Hyperboreia as Dark Knight, and the group was just excellent across the board. We even had the Samurai use Limit Break 2 on the final boss, and not even as an execute, and the dancer made sure to interrupt when I was forgetting to. We really covered each other. Something I often do, especially as Dark Knight, is to perform what I have started referring to as interlaced defensive cooldown cycling, or double stuffed even. If you've seen my tank guides, you may recognize defensive cooldown cycling as the idea that you want to plan out your defensive so you always have something running throughout AoE pull fights. This idea expands on that. A lot of the time, you have way more defensives than you actually need, and if you just sit on them waiting to reach that point in your plan, they will just go unused. By then sprinkling these cooldowns out across the regular plan, you of course reduce the total length of the fight you will have defensive cooldowns for, but as long as the fight ends early enough, this is completely inconsequential. Some simpler examples of this is that for Dark Knight, Oblation and Reprisal both have cooldowns of 1 minute, so you should have access to each of them at least once per AoE pull. For Dark Knight, the fact that TBN is just a barrier also means that using it on cooldown can massively reduce the total healing you require, while still making sure to defensive cooldown cycle at the same time. Anyway, the thing is, this kind of interlacing of defensives I feel often requires thinking on the fly what you don't need and then adjusting accordingly, meaning that it can be hard to actually teach in a proper guide. So I felt I would just mention it as an idea to consider. Moving on the second boss, we had this little misunderstanding where everyone but me positioned wrong for this, leading to a lot of damage, but no deaths. For Duty 6, we went to the Aetherochemical Research Facility, or ARF, as Scholar, and the duty started a bit slow as the Gunbreaker didn't seem too keen on pulling multiple packs at a time. I do understand that, as their gear seemed to indicate they were a very new Gunbreaker. Fortunately, most of the duty doesn't have any options to pull big, so it didn't change that much. Aside from this, the group was great about doing mechanics. On the first boss, the group was dealing with the Magitech bit adds. On the second boss, we had, for the first time in a long while, the 2-stack successfully dealt with. And for the final boss, our tank had some issues keeping aggro on both bosses initially, but got it figured out eventually. Once that was figured out, the rest of the fight went very nice and safe, with everyone doing the mechanics. Even the dual star mechanic with no major issues. A very nice run despite the slow start. For Duty 7, we went to Lunar Subterrane as Machinist, which went very normally as these expert roulettes tend to do. On the first boss, I had a bit of a mess up where I forgot to move out of the line AoEs, but fortunately the healer was quick to save me. Speaking of the healer, it felt like they were very excited to use Evcration Prognosis for a lot of AoE attacks, which often led to them being low or almost outright out of MP at certain points. They probably did not need to do that, but it didn't cause any major problems. The Dragoon was very good about using their cooldowns throughout the duty. Unfortunately, I was not exactly the best about aligning my cooldowns to make use of the buffs they granted me. Also, the tank in this group was excellent, pulled very well, dealt with boss mechanics well, positioned the bosses well for the Dragoon, and most importantly, was named Tartarus Bulldozer, which is a perfect name for their character. A particular example of how accommodating they were for the Dragoon is here in the final boss, where they pulled the boss all the way out and turned him, so that the Dragoon could be safe on the outer ring with the tank being closer to the AoEs. Just, overall, an amazingly good run. For Duty 8, we have one of the spoilery Endwalker duties. If you have yet to complete the Endwalker leveling story, you may want to jump to this timestamp shown on screen if you don't want to see it. Otherwise, we of course went to the Aitiascope as Warrior, which went perfectly safely of course. On the first boss, we had some trouble with this mechanic where the line AoEs go out and then return shortly after. Fortunately, no one died as a result. Near the end of the second boss, I got worried I wouldn't make it to the safe spot, leading to me spending the sprint I would need for the next AoE pull. I also had the saddest primal rend that just ticked out. I have previously talked a lot about sprinting, and it usually comes up in relation with this pull, and you're very welcome to compare this pull with the time where I sprinted despite my healer lacking sprint. This time, I take a lot of damage and feel that using equilibrium is necessary to actually survive until reaching my destination. I hope this really highlights how big of a difference it makes whether you sprint while pulling or not, as I did not need to use anything else when I sprinted while pulling, even with a healer potentially falling behind. On the final boss, we had the grim reminder that it is his left. Remember, when the boss is looking at you and saying left, it means his or her left. And also, a lesson in moving early, although I think the healer actually forgot to move and remembered too late, which happens. Maybe he was busy derping out? Understandable for Dr. Derbalot himself. We didn't wipe as a result, so everything was perfectly fine anyway. By the way, did you know that Warrior can solo the Aitiascope synced? For duty 9, I was a 9-minute replacement as Sage in Holminster Switch again. What happened? Well, they did a big pull, as you can see, because all the mobs were already spawned in, but then they wiped, and the healer either lost connection or outright rage quit. Either way, they were without a healer. The tank was okay about defensive cooldowns. Definitely could be better, but given how they were already apologizing for their tanking before we even started, I felt they needed a victory more than advice. So I just let them do their thing and I would cover for their mistakes. I did feel they did somewhat improve over the course of the duty just on their own. Overall, my verdict is that they were using defensives, but not always very well. They were pulling big, but not always great about making sure they picked up everything. Fortunately, both of the DPS were good about delivering the mobs to the tank. I should also mention the tank did have level 80 gear, but I guess we all have to start somewhere. Maybe they bought a level skip and needed practice. The important part is that they admitted needing more experience, warning me to be ready for them if needed. As a result, the duty went mostly safely. Although, on the final boss, it turned out the samurai got a bit too into the running zone and managed to get themselves stomped out in the spinning mechanic here. And finally, for duty 10, the final number 200, we went as Black Mage to Paglth'an. Throughout the entire duty, the warriors seemed to just pull weird. Like, sometimes they would pull just one pack, other times they would do straight up chain pulling, and yet other times they would do proper AoE pulls. It made it very difficult to predict how they were going to go forward. And if there were ranged mobs in the packs, it was a toss-up whether they would pick them up, tank on them, or just leave them entirely so a DPS had to tank them. There was also a lack of motivation for stacking the mobs up properly, so I often had to choose between which side of the packs I attacked. Overall, the duty went fine, of course, but it felt like it really dragged out, that there were all these smaller issues with the packs. Because of all the oddities with the tank, I didn't pay that much attention to the rest of the group. However, I did see this ability-based super mega wombo combo from the Sage here at the end, and I have no clue why they suddenly did all that, but it certainly looked funny. Yevkrasia. Wait. Yevkrasian doses, then Panheimer, Holos, Caracoli, Physis, Ixocholi, Yevkrasian prognosis. Perfect. Now everything is set up for the multi-stack marker, and Panheimer ended just as the stack marker started resolving. Speaking of the last boss, this is perhaps a good opportunity to talk about cooldown planning. Usually you want to use your cooldowns on cooldown, but it makes sense to hold something if you expect to not get full value out of it if you use it immediately. Knowing something about a fight, but not knowing the fight well enough to be sure, can lead to issues where you hold a cooldown because you know there's something coming up that will get in the way, but not remembering exactly when that is. This led to me sitting on ley lines for like a good plus 30 seconds when I could have easily used it, because I planned to use it after Lunar Bahamut came back. I felt this made sense to highlight because it isn't an uncommon question I get asked in regards to what you do when wanting to plan out your rotation. Sometimes you just gotta try things. Next time, I will remember that I have way more time to ley lines than I thought, and probably will ley lines immediately. Finally, did you know that Warrior can solo Paglth'an synced? In fact, of all the duties in this set, the only duties that a warrior cannot solo synced is Praetorium and Orf, both due to DPS checks. Now, that was a whole 200 Mentor Roulettes, and this does serve as the finale of this series of Mentor Roulettes before Dawntrail. Once Dawntrail releases, I will have to re-level a lot of jobs, and also complete the extremes of Endwalker that I have yet to complete. And, of course, clear any other mentor requirements, as well as catch up on all the other new stuff before this series can resume. But this is certainly not the end of my Mentor Roulette journey. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, you only needed 300 commendations to become a mentor. With the release of Shadowbringers, this requirement jumped to 1,500 commendations. Since then, so far, this requirement has not increased, although even if it did, I think a lot of long-term mentors will be fine, considering I have 5,000 commendations, just to give an example.